So Luca Guadagnino's Queer is based on the William S. Burroughs novel of a writer in the 1950s in Mexico seeking just gay sex and booze and drugs and trying to find something worth living for. Now, I know that, the other Guadagnino film we got this year was Challengers, which was, it was dynamic, it was full of energy, it was highly erotic, and it engaged you from beginning to end. So, Queer is very much a change of pace. It's much more slow, it's much more thoughtful, a bit more cerebral, and I think it's a pretty good chaser. Like, it still has a lot of what you'd expect from Guadagnino with his directing style. It also has a soundtrack by Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, but while Atticus and Ross's score in Challengers was very was very aggressive, and it felt like it was like another character in the room amid this love triangle. Queer is a lot more. It's a lot more gentler. It was surprising to hear Reznor and Ross kind of the way that they placed music on the story, which did feel fitting, but it was surprising how perfectly it matched the tone. So the whole story is that Daniel Craig plays Lee, who is an aged writer who's just desperate to seek anything to feel alive. He spends his nights in Mexico, cruising the bars, looking for any men that are interested, that would share his glances, and he just he's a little bit shy. He sits around the bar, ordering drinks, looking around, seeing, if any dudes are interested, and then he thinks someone might be interested, but then when he realizes, oh, maybe not, he just finishes his drink, leaves, goes to another bar, and repeats the process further and further until eventually he finds someone to go to bed with. Unfortunately, he's very desperate. He really wants to just find someone to love, anybody in this scene, that he'll go with anybody who's willing, to the point where he's willing to just give. When we get to the first sex scene, when he actually does bring someone to bed, he takes charge. He takes full charge. He's doing everything just because he wants he wants that moment to last. He's hoping that he can just find something to make him feel good again, and isn't sure that that love would be in the equation, and just embraces sex, which is kind of his whole deal with just embracing the vice of this scenario. If he can't find someone to go to bed with that night, he'll either just keep drinking, or he'll resort to heroin. And as the film goes on, we kind of learn why he's doing all this, because he's trying to fight off the demons of his past that did involve drugs, and it's still haunting him to this day. So he needs something, anything, to just find something worth living for the next day. And I mean, he does have friends. He does have another gay friend, Joe, played by a pretty hefty Jason Schwartzman, and Joe is kind of he's kind of more of the runt of his gay scene, because Joe will constantly talk about how he does take some men to bed, but then they'll also end up stealing from him, and he doesn't have much luck on that front. He just keeps talking about everything that gets stolen from him. So Lee does have some friendship during the day, but when night falls, he's desperate for any form of passion that he can find. And thankfully, he does find someone who might be more of a romantic companion in the form of Eugene Allerton, played by Drew Starkey. And he is a U.S. serviceman who is also kind of looking for, looking for some fun, but in much more of a quiet nature. Lee will often get into conversations very quickly and be a little bit desperate to to maintain focus, whereas Eugene is a lot more calm. He's more serene. In fact, when they first meet in the streets, amid a cockfight of everything, where they share glances, and I love the fact that for that scene, Guadagnino chose this very modern music to place on top of it. Which I think is kind of interesting, how Guadagnino plays with time here, trying to evoke the right sensation more than I think historical accuracy, because he does get a bit fantastical here. He does things do get very psychological and surreal as the film goes on. And the relationship that develops between Lee and Eugene is rather unique. Like I love the scene where Lee first invites Eugene back to his place. And they share a drink, and the drinks go a little bit awry because like eventually Eugene ends up puking, but that doesn't end up stopping the night from ending in sex, where of course Lee wants to initiate, but then the thing that he doesn't expect is that Eugene reciprocates. And it's a very, very erotic and a very, very touching, and little tinges of sadness are in that scene. And the perfect companion for that is very much Reznor and Ross's soundtrack. Because if you listen closely to that track from the film, it starts off very quiet, very serene, almost a little bit like whimsical, that you might hear on like a little bit of like a light romantic comedy. And it's very sweet, it's very somber, and it kind of like progresses. And then when it starts getting more into like the sex scenes, the music becomes a little bit louder and a little bit more aggressive, where some electronic does come in there, and it feels like it's just like echoes of electronics, just to more or less like symbolize like the orgasms that they're having. And just like the way that it perfectly encapsulates that moment that's supposed to be sweet, but also, intense, and bringing out like that passion there. It's, for as much as I want to say that this isn't as much like Challengers, Reznor and Ross's soundtrack does feel like another person in the room with them. Just because like it perfectly matches the tone that is going for here. And even though this is a film that it's very linear, unlike Challenger. It's like it's diced up into chapters here, and there is an adventure to it where Lee and Eugene go on a trip through the forest to basically find like this drug which Lee believes will grant him like telepathy, where he'll be able to connect with people on a much grander level, which would seem like like the ultimate prize for Lee. And of course, we can kind of like deduce that this film is a bit fantastical, but it won't resolve itself so easily, so you expect there to be some tragedy when it gets to that moment. But it's a tragedy that's like, it's like don't get me wrong, it's melancholic, but I think it's also a bit transient in the way that kind of like Lee learns to try to realize that he might not have Lee to always be there for him, especially since Lee might realize that Eugene is not always going to be there for him, because Eugene starts realizing that Lee is a handful. Like he's desperate. Like the nights where Eugene doesn't spend them with Lee, like Lee will get like desperate. He'll resort to drugs and drinking again, and sometimes he'll just stumble over to Eugene's place, like trying to get more of his attention, because he can't bear to be alone with his thoughts and his nightmares and his echoes of the past. And even when they go on this trip to South America to find this drug, Lee's drug use just gets worse, and Eugene he kind of silently accepts it, but there's also this realization that Eugene is probably not going to hang around Lee that long. And when they get to that moment where Lee and Eugene take this drug that's supposed to like supposedly give them telepathy, and they start connecting on a level that's that feels beyond like mind and body. Like you see like their vision of basically them like putting their hands through each other's naked bodies and like feeling something more. Lee just realizes that it might not be enough, or that Eugene's not going to reciprocate, and it's a very like tragic moment, but also like a very sobering moment of like realization, especially when the film with its epilogue, it just goes straight up surreal, and how it tries to find any lingering notion of what we seek out of life when when our time is up, when time passes for so long, and we feel like we haven't quite found like that golden treasure that you think is going to make life grand, or grant you immortality, or make you feel so much better about yourself, and just forget the past. Like it's never quite there. And I think just kind of recognizing the sweeter and the quieter moments that Lee kind of more or less realizes by the end, is just surprisingly sad and sweet at the same time, and perfectly communicated through the soundtrack. So yeah, there are a lot of like erotic moments between Lee and Eugene, but also like very, very touching moments, especially moments where Eugene is like comforting Lee when he's at his worst. Like at one point, Lee is just suffering, from like the shakes of like, of him taking so many drugs, and Lee is still there to like comfort him in bed. And it's those moments that kind of stick with Lee as the film goes on. So I love the way that the film is written, the way that it takes its time, the way that that it goes into surreal and nightmarish territory and never just stops to explain everything. Like there's never a moment where it's highly expositional, where Lee just sits down and explains his past. Like we only get bits and pieces of it through trippy visions that come as the film kind of goes along. And Daniel Craig's performance in this role, I honestly think this is the best of his career. I think just because this is such a nuanced performance where, like, Craig has to play this guy who feels like he's in control when, like, he's around Eugene, and is desperate when he's not, and just terrified of his dreams when he visits them. And this is a role that requires a lot, and I think that Craig just nails it. And like Drew Starkey, I think, more or less just is kind of just like there embracing the ride, and I think has this quiet dignity to him, which is perfect to play off of with Daniel Craig here. Like they do an amazing job when they're both on screen. And yeah, I haven't read the William S. Burroughs novel, but I did hear that it was shelved for a few decades before it was eventually published. And that even when it was published, Burroughs didn't really consider himself that much ingrained within like the queer movement and the queer scene. And I think I almost kind of think that, like, and maybe this might change when I read the book, but I think that Guadagnino might have been trying to figure out why someone might feel that distant. And unwilling to like embrace that part of themselves, and I wonder if that played a role in like deciding the direction of this film, because from what I've heard Guadagnino describe this film as, is that when he read the book, he considered it unfinished. He felt like there's not enough explored here, like there should be something more, and I feel like there is this daringness to explore odder territories with this type of material, because it's not just like, I would for lack of a better term, I do think it's a little bit more like a David Lynch puzzle box as it goes along, just because like it becomes much more surreal, especially by the epilogue. Like the epilogue just bombards you with cryptic imagery, and just is kind of like begging your attention to try to like figure out what Lee ultimately takes away from his time in Mexico and his time with Eugene, and just being involved in the Mexico nightlife. But for establishing that atmosphere, it's beautifully like serene and sad, and the fact that Guadagnino takes his time, like like I said, if Challengers was like the shot, Queer is kind of like the less aggressive chaser. This film is very slow, like, and in fact it's very like it's diced up into chapters, but it is very meandering at times, despite its very linear storytelling here. That I get the film runs 2.5 hours, so like if you're not willing to be engaged with a bit of like a slow burn romance, it's not too slow, but it does meander into different territories here to kind of establish Lee and his environment. If you're willing to stick with it if you're willing to stick with the film, it works surprisingly well. Like I just found myself just gazing up at the screen, just trying to figure it out, just being amazed by this odyssey that Lee goes on. And just Daniel Craig's performance in this just works so damn well. It's one of the best of his career. So yeah, I loved the hell out of Queer. It's a damn good Luca Guadagnino film, and an even better Daniel Craig film.